Mid-sentence, through reciting quarterly margins, the executive abruptly crumpled beneath the pristine boardroom table. As dark blood stained the sterile corporate environment, the city's two most powerful alphas rushed forward to rip away his soaked collar, unearthing the horrifying reality of his secret life in an instant. Luca Blake was a master of the invisible arts. At 26, as the senior financial analyst for Russo and Montgomery Capital, his days were built on precision numbers and an exhausting web of lies. To the rest of the world, Luca was a dedicated, slightly aloof beta with a brilliant mind for corporate acquisitions. He was the golden boy of the analytics department, the man who never took a sick day, who never complained, and who lived for the thrill of the spreadsheet. But reality was a much darker, much more violent picture. On the morning of November 14th, the rain in Chicago was coming down, in sheets matching the relentless pounding ache in Luca's skull. Standing in front of his bathroom mirror, he carefully applied a heavy layer of stage-grade concealer to his collarbone, his jaw, and the delicate skin of his throat. His hands, usually so steady when typing out multi-million-dollar forecasts, trembled violently. The bruises were fresh. Deep mottled purples and angry, swollen reds painted a horrific map across his pale skin. They were gifts from Tristan Pierce. Tristan was the heir to Pierce Logistics, a prominent alpha in the city's high society, and the man Luca had been secretly chained to for 3 agonizing years. Their relationship was an open secret only in the darkest, most private circles of the elite. To the public, Tristan was a charismatic bachelor. Behind the heavy oak doors of his penthouse, he was a monster. Tristan despised that Luca was an Omega, a status Luca had hidden since he entered the corporate world, fearing it would destroy his career. Tristan fed off that fear, using it to isolate Luca, control him, and punish him for every perceived slight. Last night had been worse than usual. A perceived disrespect at a private dinner party had resulted in Tristan throwing Luca against a sharp-edged glass console table. Luca was certain he had at least 2 cracked ribs, and a jagged, poorly bandaged laceration on his left shoulder blade was still oozing blood. "Just get through the 2 p.m. meeting," Luca whispered to his reflection, his voice raspy. He reached into his medicine cabinet and pulled out a small, unmarked amber bottle. Suppressants. Black market, highly concentrated, and incredibly dangerous. He swallowed 3 dry, ignoring the warning label that explicitly stated never to exceed 1. He couldn't afford a single drop of his natural scent, crushed lavender and petrichor, to leak out. Not today. When Luca arrived at the towering glass and steel headquarters of Russo and Montgomery, he forced his posture straight. Every step sent a white-hot flare of agony through his torso, but he masked it behind a cold, professional expression. He had barely set his briefcase down in his cubicle when a deep, resonant voice called out to him. "Luca, just the man we need to see." Luca turned, suppressing a wince, to face Nicholas Russo. Nicholas, the CEO, was an alpha of terrifying presence and immense power. Tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Beside him stood Caleb Montgomery, the VP of Operations, and Nicholas's oldest friend. Caleb was equally imposing an alpha, whose easygoing smile often masked a razor-sharp intellect and a fiercely protective nature. For 2 years, Luca had worked directly under them. They respected him, they trusted his numbers, and terrifyingly, they had always treated him with a strange, lingering gentleness that made Luca's suppressed Omega instincts weep with longing. "Good morning, Mr. Russo." "Mr. Montgomery," Luca said, keeping his voice even. "Nicholas Luca." "We've been over this," Nicholas corrected, gently leaning against the edge of Luca's desk. Nicholas narrowed his eyes slightly, leaning in a fraction of an inch. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right? We have the Pierce Logistics acquisition meeting this afternoon. If you need to tap out, I can have Sarah handle the presentation." The mention of the Pierce account made Luca's blood run cold. It was the irony of his life he had been assigned to audit the very company owned by his abuser's family. "I'm perfectly fine, Nicholas," Luca lied smoothly. "Just a bit of a headache. The numbers are solid. I'm ready for the 2 o'clock. Caleb stepped closer, his brow furrowing. He sniffed the air discreetly. Luca's heart hammered against his broken ribs. Because of the heavy dose of suppressants, Luca should smell like absolutely nothing. But the black market pills were fighting against an extreme stress response and a high fever Luca hadn't realized he was running. "You're shaking, Ollie." Caleb noted his voice, dropping into a low, rumbling register that vibrated right in Luca's chest. "Seriously, we don't want you collapsing on us. Tristan Pierce is going to be sitting in on this meeting via a proxy, and his father's lawyers are sharks. You need to be at 100%. "I am," Luca insisted, stepping back to put distance between himself and the two alphas. He grabbed his tablet, his knuckles white. "I'll see you both in the boardroom at 2. As Luca walked away, he didn't see the dark, concerned look Nicholas and Caleb exchanged. He only focused on placing one foot in front of the other, praying to a god he didn't believe in, that his body would hold out for just a few more hours. By 1:45 p.m., the temperature in Luca's body had skyrocketed. The combination of the untreated laceration, the cracked ribs, and the lethal dose of suppressants was causing his internal systems to crash. His vision was swimming with dark, fuzzy spots, and a cold sweat drenched the back of his crisp white dress shirt. The executive boardroom was a sprawling, intimidating space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm raging over the city. Nicholas sat at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating quiet authority. Caleb sat to his right. Across from them sat 3 legal representatives from Pierce Logistics, their expressions stony. Luca stood at the front of the room, the glowing projection of a massive financial spreadsheet cast onto the screen behind him. "As you can see in Section 4 of the audit," Luca began, his voice sounding hollow and distant to his own ears. He clicked the remote, advancing the slide. "The operational overhead for the Pierce shipping fleet has seen a—" Luca paused. He blinked hard. The numbers on his tablet were blurring together, morphing into crawling black insects. He took a sharp breath, but his cracked ribs screamed in protest, causing the breath to hitch audibly in his throat. "Luca!" Nicholas's voice cut through the heavy silence of the room. It wasn't the voice of a CEO. It was the sharp, alert tone of an alpha sensing danger. "Apologies," Luca gasped out. He gripped the edge of the podium with his left hand, his knuckles turning translucent. The room began to spin. The floor tilted dangerously. "The overhead has seen a 20%. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt like it was trapped in a vice. The heavy concealer on his neck felt like it was burning his skin. Then the dam broke. The chemical wall of the suppressants, severely compromised by his spiking fever and physical trauma, shattered entirely. In a split second, a wave of pure, unfiltered omega pheromones exploded into the sterile air of the boardroom. But it wasn't a sweet, welcoming scent. It was soured with terror, heavy with the metallic tang of fresh blood, and screaming with primal distress. Caleb was out of his chair before Luca even registered what was happening. "He's an Omega!" Luca's knees buckled. The podium slipped from his grasp. He didn't even have the strength to brace himself for the impact. He simply collapsed mid-sentence, plummeting toward the hardwood floor. He didn't hit the ground. Nicholas moved with a terrifying, predatory speed, sliding across the polished floor to catch Luca, just before his head struck the mahogany table. Caleb was there a millisecond later, dropping to his knees beside them. "Luca, look at me! Hey, look at me!" Nicholas barked, his voice laced with a commanding alpha rumble that demanded obedience. He pulled Luca onto his lap, cradling the younger man's head. Luca's eyes rolled back, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Tristan, please, no more," he hallucinated, whispering deliriously. "I'm sorry. I'll fix the numbers. Don't." Nicholas and Caleb froze. The lawyers from Pierce Logistics stood up in shock, but Caleb shot them a glare so lethal, so saturated with territorial alpha rage, that they immediately backed away to the far wall. "He's burning up," Caleb said, his hands hovering over Luca's convulsing form. "Dom, he's bleeding. Look." Caleb pointed to the left side of Luca's pristine white shirt. A large, dark crimson stain was rapidly expanding, soaking through the fabric. "We need to check the wound. Call an ambulance right fucking now." Nicholas roared at the lawyers who scrambled for their phones. Nicholas didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lapels of Luca's suit jacket and pulled it off, tossing it aside. Then, with a harsh yank, he tore Luca's shirt open, popping the buttons off to get to the source of the bleeding. The sound that left Caleb's throat was a raw, animalistic snarl of horror. Nicholas went completely still, his blue eyes widening in absolute shock. Without the shirt, the reality of Luca's existence was laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. His torso was a canvas of abuse. Yellowing bruises overlapped with fresh, dark purple handprints around his waist. But the worst was his shoulder. A deep, jagged gash was weeping blood sluggishly surrounded by infected, inflamed skin. And just above it, hidden beneath the smeared, sweat-ruined concealer on his neck, was a bite mark. It wasn't a mating mark. It was a punishment bite. A brutal, mangled tearing of the flesh right over the omega scent gland, designed not to claim, but to maim and terrify. The scent of another alpha, rancid, aggressive, and distinctly reeking of Tristan Pierce, clung to the wound like a rotting curse. He's been hiding this," Caleb whispered, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles cracked. The protective instincts of both alphas were surging to violent, uncontrollable levels. The boardroom air was suddenly thick, oppressive, and heavy with dominant, wrathful energy. Nicholas gently brushed a sweat-soaked curl from Luca's forehead. His hand was trembling with suppressed rage. He looked down at the fragile, broken Omega. In his arms, the man who had sat in their office, and smiled softly, while carrying the weight of literal torture. Nicholas lifted his head, his eyes locking onto the Pierce lawyers cowering in the corner. His voice, when he spoke, was deadly quiet. It wasn't a question. It was a promise of destruction. "Who hurt you?" The arrival of the paramedics shattered the frozen tableau in the boardroom. They burst through the heavy glass doors with a stretcher, their radios crackling, but Nicholas Russo refused to let them touch the bleeding Omega in his arms. The towering alpha simply scooped Luca into his chest, entirely indifferent to the copious amounts of blood soaking into his custom Italian suit. "I'm carrying him," Nicholas growled, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. The paramedics, instantly recognizing the dangerous territorial aura of a highly dominant alpha protecting a wounded mate, stepped aside and merely guided him toward the freight elevator. Caleb Montgomery followed right at Nicholas's heel, his own alpha scent, usually a comforting blend of sea salt and warm amber, now spiking into something sharp, ozone-heavy, and violently protective. Before leaving the boardroom, Caleb turned his head back toward the three terrified lawyers from Pierce Logistics. "Tell Tristan Pierce," Caleb said, his voice a chilling, deadly whisper that carried across the vast room, "that if he so much as tries to leave the city, I will hunt him down myself. The acquisition is dead, and so is his empire. The ride to Chicago Memorial Hospital was a blur of flashing sirens and chaotic medical jargon. Luca's temperature had spiked to a lethal 104 degrees. In the back of the ambulance, a seasoned trauma nurse named Clara Jenkins frantically pushed IV fluids into Luca's limp arm, trying to flush the toxic cocktail of black market suppressants from his failing kidneys. "His blood pressure is tanking," Clara shouted over the wail of the siren. "The suppressants he took, they're Russian imports, highly illegal. They don't just mask an Omega's scent, they artificially paralyze the central nervous system to stop pheromone production. With his physical trauma and the infection in his shoulder, his body is going into septic shock." Caleb sat in the corner of the ambulance, his hands buried in his hair, trying to breathe through the overwhelming urge to rip something apart. Nicholas sat perfectly still beside the stretcher, his large hand gripping Luca's terrifyingly cold fingers. "Hold on, Ollie," Nicholas murmured continuously, releasing low rumbling alpha purrs from deep within his chest. It was an instinctual sound designed to soothe a distressed Omega. "Just hold on. You're safe now. I swear to God, you are safe." When they arrived at the hospital, Luca was rushed through the swinging doors of the emergency surgical wing. Nicholas and Caleb were forced to remain in the sterile, glaringly bright waiting room of the VIP floor. For 3 agonizing hours, neither man spoke. The silence between them was heavy, with a shared, crushing realization they had both been falling in love with Luca Blake for 2 years, and neither had noticed the absolute hell their Omega was enduring right under their noses. Finally, the doors opened, and Dr. Harrison Gallagher, the chief of surgery, and a beta with a stern, tired face, walked towards them. Nicholas and Caleb were on their feet instantly. "He's stabilized, Walker." "Doctor," Gallagher said, holding up a hand to stall their barrage of questions. "But it was incredibly close. We had to perform an emergency debridement on his shoulder. The laceration was severely infected. He has 3 fractured ribs, a hairline fracture on his right wrist, and severe long-term malnutrition. But—" The doctor paused, his jaw tightening in professional disgust. "The worst of it is the bite mark on his scent gland." A low, vibrating snarl ripped its way out of Caleb's throat. "It's a punishment bite," Dr. Gallagher confirmed gravely. "The tissue damage is extensive. Whoever did this deliberately mangled the gland so it couldn't properly produce slick or natural pheromones, combined with the lethal doses of illegal suppressants he's been taking for what looks like years. It's a miracle his heart didn't give out weeks ago. He's in the ICU. He's unconscious, but you can see him." The private ICU room was dim, the only sounds the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the soft hiss of the oxygen cannula resting under Luca's nose. He looked impossibly small in the center of the massive hospital bed. The heavy stage makeup had been scrubbed away, revealing the devastating truth of his pale, hollowed cheeks and the dark, violent bruising that painted his jawline. Nicholas approached the right side of the bed, Caleb taking the left. Caleb carefully reached out and laid his hand over Luca's uninjured one. As if sensing the presence of Alpha's, Luca's brow furrowed in his medically induced sleep. A whimper, thin and fractured, escaped his chapped lips. He tried to curl inward, a deeply ingrained defensive posture, and began to hyperventilate. "Tristan, no," Luca mumbled deliriously, his heart rate monitor spiking into a frantic rhythm. "I'm sorry. I cleaned the glass. I didn't mean to drop it. Please. Not the belt. Please." The words hit Nicholas and Caleb like a physical blow. Tears pricked Caleb's eyes as he dropped his forehead against the edge of the mattress. Nicholas's expression turned to stone a cold, unyielding mask of absolute resolve settling over his features. "Luca, listen to my voice," Nicholas said firmly, leaning down so his lips were mere inches from Luca's ear. He flooded the room with his scent, deep, grounding cedar and wood smoke. "Tristan is not here. Tristan will never be in the same room as you ever again. You are with Nicholas and Caleb. We have you. You are safe." Caleb added his own scent to the mix, blanketing the terrified Omega in the soothing, protective aroma of the sea. Slowly, miraculously, the violent trembling in Luca's body began to subside. His breathing evened out, and he leaned his head toward Nicholas's hand, instinctively seeking the source of the protective pheromones. "He's going to pay for this." "Dom!" Caleb whispered, his voice cracking with emotion as he looked at the bandages wrapped around Luca's delicate throat. Every drop of blood he spilled. "We're going to take everything from him." "We aren't just going to take everything, Caleb," Nicholas replied, his blue eyes flashing with a terrifying, predatory darkness. "We are going to erase Tristan Pierce from existence. Call Arthur Penhaligon. Tell him I want the war room assembled in 1 hour. Arthur Penhaligon was the most ruthless corporate defense attorney in Chicago, a man who built his career on dismantling corrupt dynasties." When Nicholas and Caleb presented him with the medical files photographs of Luca's injuries and the digital footprint of the illegal Russian suppressants traced back to an offshore account owned by Tristan Pierce, Arthur simply adjusted his glasses and smiled a shark-like grin. The retaliation was not merely a legal battle, it was a highly orchestrated slaughter. Russo and Montgomery Capital didn't just pull out of the acquisition. Over the next 48 hours, while Luca remained safely under heavy guard in the hospital, Nicholas leveraged his immense wealth to quietly buy up all of Pierce Logistics' outstanding debts. He called in favors from the banking sector, forcing Tristan's creditors to demand immediate repayment. The twist came on a Thursday morning. Tristan Pierce, desperate, backed into a corner and entirely unaware of the storm about to hit him, attempted a final, fatal play. He sent a heavily encrypted email to Caleb's private server. Attached was a severely edited, out-of-context video meant to look like Luca was embezzling corporate funds, accompanied by a blackmail demand: "Reinstate the acquisition, or I leak this to the press and send your favorite little Omega to federal prison." It was the exact mistake Caleb had been praying for. Caleb Montgomery wasn't just an operations VP. He had spent his early 20s building cybersecurity architecture for the Department of Defense. Within 10 minutes of receiving the email, Caleb had backtraced the IP address, breached Tristan's personal servers, and secured the original unedited footage, which actually showed Tristan physically assaulting Luca in his office to force him to alter financial documents. But Caleb didn't stop there. He uncovered an entire hidden drive of blackmail material Tristan had been using against board members, politicians, and other vulnerable Omegas. At 10 a.m. on Friday, Tristan Pierce walked into his company's emergency board meeting, prepared to assure his investors that the Russo deal was back on. Instead, he found Nicholas Russo and Caleb Montgomery sitting at the head of his own table, flanked by Detective Arthur Penhaligon and 4 uniformed federal agents. "What the hell is the meaning of this?" Tristan demanded, his alpha bravado slipping as he saw the federal windbreakers. "You have no jurisdiction here. Get out of my building." Nicholas stood, slowly buttoning his suit jacket with a terrifying calm. He walked around the table until he was standing face to face with the man who had tortured his mate. Tristan, despite being an alpha, instinctively took a step back under the crushing weight of Nicholas's dominant aura. "It isn't your building anymore, Tristan," Nicholas said softly. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, Pierce Logistics defaulted on $400 million in debt. Debt which my holding company now owns. I am liquidating your assets." "You can't do that," Tristan snarled, his face flushing dark red. "I have the video. I'll ruin that worthless little Omega." Before the word fully left his mouth, Caleb moved. His fist connected with Tristan's jaw with the sound of a cracking whip. Tristan collapsed backward over a leather chair, spitting blood and a broken tooth onto the carpet. The federal agents didn't even flinch to intervene. "The server you tried to blackmail me from has been seized by the FBI, along with the gigabytes of illegal leverage you've been hoarding." Caleb stood over him, shaking out his knuckles, his eyes burning with absolute hatred. "You're going away for a very long time, Tristan. Assault, corporate extortion, and trafficking illegal narcotics. But just so you know, the only reason you're going to prison in one piece is because Luca asked us not to kill you." Detective Penhaligon nodded to the agents who hauled the bleeding, disgraced Alpha off the floor and slapped heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. As Tristan was dragged out of the boardroom, screaming threats that fell on deaf ears, Nicholas pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and tossed it onto the empty table. The Empire had fallen in exactly 5 days. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere at Nicholas's sprawling, secluded lakeside estate was a world away from the sterile hospital and the blood-stained boardroom. The house was a fortress of glass and warm wood, surrounded by acres of private forest. Luca sat curled up on a massive plush sofa on the sun porch, wrapped in a thick, ridiculously oversized cashmere sweater that belonged to Caleb. The bruises on his face had faded to a pale yellow, and the heavy bandages on his shoulder had been replaced by a neat, sterile dressing. For the first time in 3 years, Luca wasn't wearing concealer. He was reading a book, his legs tucked under him, when he heard the heavy, familiar footsteps approaching from the kitchen. Nicholas and Caleb walked in, bringing with them the comforting, deeply intertwined scents of cedar smoke, sea salt and amber. Nicholas was holding 2 mugs of herbal tea, while Caleb carried a plate of warm pastries. "You're supposed to be resting your eyes, Ollie," Caleb scolded gently, though his smile was radiant as he set the plate down and took a seat right beside Luca, immediately pressing his side against the Omegas. "I was going stir-crazy," Luca protested softly, though he leaned into Caleb's warmth immediately. "Besides, I feel better today. I think the suppressants are finally out of my system." Nicholas paused as he handed Luca a mug. He inhaled deeply, his eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. It was true. Beneath the fading scent of medical antiseptic, a beautiful, delicate fragrance was blooming in the air. Crushed lavender and fresh rain. It was pure, unhindered, and incredibly sweet. "You smell perfect," Nicholas murmured, sitting on Luca's other side. He reached out his large fingers, gently, reverently tracing the edge of the healing bite mark on Luca's neck. The touch wasn't painful. It was a promise. "How is the pain?" "Manageable," Luca whispered, looking down at his tea. A blush crept up his pale cheeks. He looked up, his large, expressive eyes shifting between the 2 powerful men who had literally torn the world apart to save him. I don't know how to thank you. For the medical bills, for stopping him, for this." "You never have to thank us, Luca," Nicholas said, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned in and pressed a tender, lingering kiss to Luca's temple. Caleb reached over and gently tipped Luca's chin up. "You don't owe us anything, sweetheart. We just want you to heal. You can stay here as long as you want. Forever, if you'll let us keep you." Tears welled in Luca's eyes, but for the first time in his adult life, they weren't tears of terror. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. He wasn't broken. He wasn't a secret to be beaten and hidden away. He set his tea down and let himself be pulled into the center of their embrace, burying his face in Nicholas's chest, while Caleb wrapped strong, protective arms around his waist. The dark days of the boardroom were over. Surrounded by the warmth of his alphas, Luca closed his eyes, inhaled the scent of his new pack, and finally truly began to breathe. Did you feel the heat of that alpha rage, and the beautiful relief of Luca finally finding his true pack? If this intense, high-stakes Omegaverse drama kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love a dark, suspenseful romance with a fiercely protective ending, and subscribe to the channel for more heart-pounding, twist-filled audio stories every single week. Drop a comment below who was your favorite Alpha, Nicholas or Caleb. See you next time.